It's like this, man. You let a butterfly flapping his wings deep down in the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like, it's like that, man. That's the wind, man. Or like the dang old piano, man. It don't matter, man. It's like this old time.
All right, Dr. Ed Dutton, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
Hello, yes, okay, jolly good, yes. Hello.
So yes, I've been watching a lot of coverage, primarily from dissident media, about the sort of the state of play in the United Kingdom. Obviously, consider, kind of old stock Americans and you Brits to be cousins, right? There's a certain amount of cultural crossover there. And I've been very disturbed by what is happening in your country. It's one of the few political issues that actually gets me emotional, right? It upsets me quite a bit because your government seems to hate you, and not just in the kind of passive neglect that we've sort of become used to, but specifically they seem to be going after dissent in a sort of, just out and out authoritarian way. And so I'd be interested to talk about this new internet censorship law, especially as it regards the sort of nascent protest culture around immigration into your country. So if you could, for an American audience, could you describe the Online Safety Act just briefly?
Well, let me just say first, you say there's cultural crossover. There's much, much more than cultural crossover. And I think that explains why you and a lot of other Americans, including even Donald Trump, whose mother is from the Highlands of Scotland, are upset. Your surname is Burden. It's an English surname. It's genetic crossover. We are cousins. You are the descendants of the English people. America was founded by three groups of English people. People from the west of the country, the Celto-Saxon Cline, that founded the southern states, people from the east of the country, the Saxons that founded the northern states, and people from the Midlands that founded sort of Pennsylvania and places like that. So I think it's a much stronger bond than culture. Jamaica has a cultural bond. This is a blood bond. But going back to your question about the Online Safety Act and the Online Safety Bill as it is now, because it's been passed or come into law, well, that's just one of a number of acts of parliament that are being used to suppress the British people. But what that does, as with a lot of legislation and other activity delivered by the left, it is extremely manipulative. So it's almost like we've been taken over over the last 30 years. We've been living in the mind of an anxious teenage girl who dyes her hair purple and cuts herself because she's sad. And we've all had to live in that mind. And that is a mind that puts things like that puts safety above everything else. Safety or supposed safety and control. It's a paranoid mind. Safety and control above everything else, above freedom of expression, above freedom of association, even above truth itself. But secondly, is highly manipulative. So it will dress things up as being about safety, as being about love, as being about control in a good way. Whereas in reality, this is just a way of smuggling in repression and smuggling in control in a bad way and smuggling in, it's empowerment. So what you have with that bill overtly, with that law overtly, is it's a way of stopping children accessing hardcore pornography on the internet. And this was raised by a case of, I think, some woman that some girl that had accessed pornography of the most violent and unpleasant kind, which was probably illegal anyway, and had acted upon it or something and hurt herself or got killed by getting in touch with somebody that was into severe sadomasochistic porn. So that was the first thing. So it's an emotional knee-jerk reaction to a case of one particular woman who was injured or killed, and her mother campaigning. It's never good to pass laws in the wake of some dramatic event, in the wake of emotion. But of course, that's what they've done. So it's overtly that, and it's overtly a way of stopping children from entering chat rooms or whatever that might relate to porn, and thus allowing paedophiles to get in touch with them. But as part of the Act of Parliament, it also defines as dangerous various other kinds of online content, in particular content relating to, the far right, or content relating to certain kinds of political, which is then very, 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 very vaguely delineated. So if you are in favor of ethno-nationalism, if you are protesting against government policies in relation to immigration, anything like that can be considered dangerous and come under the purview of the bill. And this means that the website owners are under a legal obligation to take the age of anyone that might access that content. And in many cases, they can't afford to do that. They don't have the technology to do that. So the simplest solution is just to ban that content in the UK. So it becomes like an overactive smoke alarm, where just in case something might offend against this act and lead the website owner or whatever in court or subject to a substantial fine in the UK, then they just ban the content from the UK. And that is what I suspect it's really about. It's about censorship. This bill overtly, it's about stopping children from accessing hardcore pornography. Who could object to that? That's part of the Act of Parliament. I mean, you say it's online safety, manipulative, emotional title. Who can object to that? Online safety, hope not hate, whatever, right? Anti-racism. Who can object to these words? Nobody. Manipulative title. But within that bill are provisions that essentially require signing information for content of a political nature. And of course, most content providers cannot afford or just can't be bothered to go through the red tape of finding a way to verify you to have a look at this information. So the solution, or they can't be 100% sure it doesn't fall foul of the act and they won't get fined. So just to be on the safe side, as Twitter has done, they just block it from the UK. And there have been cases of this already, of people on the scene where these riots are happening outside these illegal immigrant hotels now in a number of parts of the UK, where you just can't access the video in the United Kingdom because it might fall foul of the act. They don't want to risk it. So it's a manipulative way, a very manipulative way of smuggling through censorship laws, but by only talking about how it's going to stop children having access to hardcore porn and being contacted by paedophiles. It's rather like that there was an act, I think there was some kind of law, or there was a referendum in Russia some years ago. And part of that referendum was that the President Putin should be allowed to serve for more than 2 consecutive terms or something like that, right? That was part of the referendum. But there were other things in the referendum, good things, about, I don't know, about liberalizing economics or something like that. And all they advertised on the news was people saying, oh, yeah, well, I'm going to vote for it because it's going to make prices cheaper or it's going to make international trade better. And they completely ignored that what that allowed them to smuggle through was a president for life. That element of it was ignored.
Well, this is a classic tactic, right? Perhaps the most infamous example is the Patriot Act, right? Like, oh, of course you want to support the Patriot Act. If you don't, you must be the opposite of a patriot, right? A traitor. Right, effectively branding what was a massive, expansion of the surveillance powers of our state on our own citizens, right, as simply patriotism. To go back a little bit, you spoke about the way in which we're sort of trapped inside the brain of a sort of a Tumblrite teenager, and you mentioned the obsession with safety, which is true. But it would be a mistake to say obsessed with literal physical safety, right? Because if this would be a different conversation, if England was sort of like a Chinese city, right, where there's absolutely no violence whatsoever and no dissent, where you're sort of locked into this nursing home society.
No, you're right. You're right. It's feeling safe, and that's why the metaphor works, though, doesn't it?
Exactly.
It's the complicated, contradictory nature of the female mind. So the female is very, very socially anxious, And because she's socially anxious, she wants to conform to whatever the way is of doing things. And indeed, because she's socially anxious, to reassure herself that she is conforming and to covertly gain status, she will, and thus kind of unconsciously move in such a way as to get the best boys or the highest status girlfriends. She will uber socially conform. She will competitively socially conform. And in a context in which you are evolved to a harem, which they are, females, and in which they create small cliques of fellow potential allo parents for their own hypothetical children, rather like in Sex and the City, you know, the gang of four that have a clear identity as a gang, where there's an us. You don't really get that with men, with male friendship groups. They're much more fluid. Then, of course, safety means that no one is challenging the system. No one is challenging the way things are. That's what safety is. So it's a kind of psychological safety. And this leads to some interesting tensions whereby you virtue signal about, you display to other women your kindness, because that's what you're judged on if you're a woman. You're judged on how kind you are, how unambitious you are, how nice you are, how conformist you are, to the extent to which you don't rock the boat. That's what you're judged on. Or if you do rock the boat, it's in a direction of making it even more kind and lovely, supposedly. And so this, of course, then leads to a point where they virtue signal to the point where they will say, I would rather be raped than racist. Like, it gets to that point, because the worst thing you can be is a racist. And so in a sense, you're signaling your virtue by saying you'd rather be raped than racist. And you are signaling your virtue by creating a situation where you are more likely to be raped, because in doing so, you are signaling your kindness to these poor darling foreign young men. And they also induce in you, I suspect, because we have more and more women who are delaying their fertility, who should have children and don't, and they elicit from you your maternal instincts. So you kind of mother these, and you can so easily romanticize them, of course, in a way that you can't people that you know. You can't people of your own race or your own class, but you can them, because they're other and different and a step away and can be romanticized. And so then you get this fascinating tension where, ironically, they are making it much less safe for themselves in pursuit of the social safety of uber socially conforming. The other thing that is worth mentioning in that regard is there's a very interesting book, I don't know if you're familiar with it, by Menelaus Apostolou, called Sexual Selection Under Parental Choice. And I looked at it in a book I wrote called Witches, Feminism and the Fall of the West. Now, what he argues is that over a very long time, women have been sexually selected by men to be patriarchal, to conform to the patriarchy, and to want to conform to the patriarchy. Because if you're in a situation as a man where you're being forced to invest in the female to get sex, then obviously you want to control the female so you can know that the offspring are yours. So from this, you get patriarchy. Now, you further get a situation where women will gravitate around high-status men, because if they have a high-status husband, he has good genes and they have more money to invest in her and the offspring, and so he's attractive, and they'd rather be one of a harem to one high-status man than be the only wife to a low-status man. But this, of course, has an interesting consequence. The high-status man can be picky. Well, who's he going to be picky for? He's going to be picky for the kind of women that won't cuckold him, i.e. the kind of women that are religious, that are conservative, that are low in sociosexuality, that will be conformist to the patriarchy. So we literally have been selecting for patriarchal women. So they are used to and evolved to a situation, a lot decreasingly now since the collapse of Darwinian selection in 1800, but up until that point, they are evolved to a situation where their fathers and brothers tell them what to do. Take that, and they do what they're told. Take that situation away and indoctrinate people that are very socially conformist and thus very indoctrinatable with this idea that, oh, you go, girl, you be free, you look after yourself, you go and get a career, you know, you do all this stuff, you're free and independent, you're a strong woman, you know. And they get themselves into the South Park situation where Macho Man Randy Savage is beating them to death. They put themselves in a stupid and dangerous situation because no one is there to force them not to. And that's another dimension to this. These women, left to their own devices, are creating a dangerous situation for themselves.
Well, definitely. And you see this in the sort of eternal news story of, you know, XYZ progressive woman journeys to Afghanistan and is beheaded, right? These stories come up from time to time. Oftentimes in modernity, they're vloggers or people who want to, you know, document themselves, right? Again, that sort of virtue signaling, engaging with the third world. Like, I'll show all of those, you know, horrible racist gammon or chuds in our context that they're not that bad, right? And then they're, you know, turned into a snuff film by some criminal organization or something. But again, right, it is that unbounded by social limitation, right? With no one to tell you, no, stop. That instinct to extreme social conformity is unbounded, right? There's no limiting principle put upon it. And very clearly, it creates dangerous and harmful situations. And that instinct towards security is interesting because it is a conflation of security for consensus with personal security, right? And oftentimes in a legislative sense, they're sort of talked in the same.
Another way of putting it is women are adapted to a very specific social niche. And some people one might even argue that it is a more specific social niche than men are adapted to.
Well, you could definitely say that when you consider, and this is not my field, but the greater variability of men, right? That would indicate that they are more specialized, right? If there's more variability, but I'll throw it back to you.
No. It's the opposite. If there's more variability, they're less specialized. Because
excuse me, my mistake.
Yeah. So men have more variability. Men are. I mean, this distinction, or this spectrum rather, that some of your viewers may be familiar with, the RK spectrum: fast, slow life history. Fast life history, you live fast, you die young. You pass through genes as quickly as possible, an unstable, easy ecology. You're a generalist. You can go and survive anywhere, right? As the ecology gets closer to its carrying capacity for the species and it gets harsher and more competitive, then you become more adapted to that very specific ecology in order to survive. And to find specific niches in which to survive. And so everything slows down and you become more environmentally plastic in a way because you've got to compete more. So you've got to find very narrow niches that you can survive in. And so there's less hardware and more software as you move towards a slow life history strategy. And everything slows down and you become more pro-social and you become more cooperative and all of these things that are basically more woman-like. And so I do think that women are in some measures, not on all, but on some measures, they are basically less instinctive, and therefore it is more important for them that they are guided along the correct roadmap of life. And the fact that they are, even if that's not true, the fact that they are evolved to the patriarchy and they're evolved to have things done for them and whatever by the patriarchy means that if the patriarchy collapses, that's not that serious for men. Because men, as you say, are generalists. Men have more variability. Men are probably more instinctive anyway. Faster life history strategists. They're more interested in sex than nurture. It's a faster way of living. Whereas women, no, they need to be in the very specific environment that they're evolved to, or they'll go mad. Like Japanese people, perhaps, have gone mad because they're not in the very specific environment to which they are evolved. So I think part of it is just the contradictions in the way in which women are adapted, such that we are able, in a normal environment, a normal, relatively harsh ecology, you can't get runaway virtue signaling. You can't get runaway individualism in the sense of the moral foundations of equality and harm avoidance, the individually oriented foundations, which women are more interested in than men, by the way. They're much more interested in those foundations than they are in the group oriented foundations of in-group loyalty and obedience to authority. It can't go on forever because it comes up against a wall, and that wall is normally a war or an invasion or something like that shakes everybody up, or a massive disease outbreak that shakes everybody up. And so then you move back. There's a backlash towards conservatism, which may well be starting, by the way, precisely because this has gone so far that it's got to a point now in the UK where it's just, I'm not even exaggerating, it's the daily rape. It's the daily, every day is reported a rape by one of these migrant men on a young English woman. Now, why is that the case? Well, to be perfectly, I don't know if this is going on YouTube, but I can't say these things on there. But what we're talking,
I'll edit it out if you say something that can't be said.
Okay, all right, okay. I won't say the N word then.
No, go say whatever you want. We can beep it out.
But we have two. There are modal differences in behavior and intelligence between Europeans and the kinds of groups that are coming into the country. From Afghanistan, from the Middle East, from Africa, whatever. There are modal differences in agreeableness, lower, conscientiousness, lower, general neuroticism, though not anxiety, higher, but things like anger and whatever, higher. And then you have what one might call the representative outliers of each group. So you're going to get outliers of these groups that are extremely unpleasant. They're extremely low in impulse control and extremely low in agreeableness and extremely high in neuroticism in a way that is not the case among the native population. And to make matters worse, they are generally young men. Now, these personality traits, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and neuroticism, agreeableness goes up with age, conscientiousness goes up with age, neuroticism goes down with age. So we basically become more pro-social as we get older, except a blip in mid to late adolescence where these traits reverse, where we become less impulsive, less agreeable, and more neurotic. Now, it's been argued that we do that because it helps us to break with our parents' family. It helps us to be brilliant fighters in the wars that we're adapted to for our tribe. It helps us to, show off in front of the women, whatever. But that's the age group these men are. So not only are they from a culture, from a group essentially that is higher in these antisocial traits on average, but then they are at the most antisocial age group they could possibly be with those traits. So of course, if you've got enough of them in the country, and we now have a lot of them, then eventually, I'm afraid, you're going to get to a situation where it is the daily rape, particularly if we are talking about women, English women, that have been inculcated to be anti-patriarchal, to be anti-conservative, to not in any way fear men, really, or at least not in the way they should. And so, of course, then there's this situation, which probably wouldn't have been the case as recently as 25 years ago, in England, where you have women just walking around on their own. I don't mean to victim blame here. I mean, it should be the case, and it is the case in, for example, most of Finland, where it used to be the case. Again, then they started bringing in the refugees. But, I mean, in 2003, when I first came to Finland, girls would hitchhike from their local village to the town with the pub and hitchhike back again. And no one thought anything of it. And then we had cases of a girl walking home from school, a 14-year-old girl in Kempele, and she was raped by an Afghan. We have cases of a girl that was raped in the park in the city centre, all kinds of stuff, which has shaken Finnish girls out of their stuff a bit. But that's the situation. And so we just get a point where our leaders can't accept this because they've reached via, you asked me about, you said something earlier about us, the leaders hating us. We can talk about why. They can't possibly accept this because their moral virtue and thus their power is born out of their adherence to multiculturalism. So this can't be true. It just can't. And so all they can come out, and they've allowed the influence of Asians and whatever in the society to become so substantial as well. And they've promoted it for such a long time, multiculturalism, the joys of multiculturalism. It's our greatest strength. And so all you end up with is just this inertia where they can't really do anything. And so it'll just get worse and worse and worse, I suspect, until something snaps.
Well, and this is not necessarily what I want to talk about, but as an interesting aside, the degree to which that principle of multiculturalism is shared by every major party cannot be overstated, right? There have been these sort of back-to-back historic elections the Boris comes in with an amazing victory on the back of, kind of mealy-mouthed promises to, get rid of this problem. And when he doesn't, is punished by a equally shocking victory for labor. And again, in either case, nothing changed, right? The replacement migration keeps going. And so just from the outside looking in, it seems as if that is a large part of the discontent.
Well, we can look at what underpins this. I think it's important to look at what has underpinned this. I'll be perfectly frank with your American viewers. I don't particularly like coming to America. And the reason I don't like coming to America is a number of reasons I don't. When you go to an American airport, your entry to America, there's lovely places in America, but your entry to America from Europe is always through somewhere appalling.
Yes. Yeah.
So maybe the airport in Chicago is it O'Hare Airport?
Yes.
Is not quite as ghastly as JFK.
That's sort of damning by faint praise, Mr. Dutton.
or Dallas. Dallas was the worst. Good God. But absolute chaos was Dallas. No English Americans. They're all Mexicans.
Yes, the competency crisis we are seeing writ large in America in the West, with actually, weirdly enough, the passing of the Patriot Act, airports became an extension of the DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles, which, if you have ever seen a piece of American media, has been a stock joke for 50 years as just exactly like an incompetent jobs program for exactly the sort of government clients who work in such places. I will leave you to your point, but yes, you were completely correct.
Yeah, so that's a bad start. I don't like the fact that you don't add the taxes to your prices. I regard that as manipulative lying. And I don't like the pressure to tip. That affects me off. Just include it in the price advertised on the menu. But basically, you're making out your prices are 30% less than they are. Fuck off. Right? It's lying. But otherwise, there are many things I like about America. And one of the things I like about America is you have this robust constitution that was put in place at a time when we were probably, as a people, the European people, the most intelligent we ever were. And it was put in place by those people, and it's robust and it's kind of semi-worshipped in a way, which is very important, because then it's difficult to question, and it enshrines certain things that you can't mess about with. So you have the three branches of the government essentially, and they're separate, right? The presidency, the parliament, whatever you call it, their House of Representatives, and the Supreme Court. That is politically manipulated, but it's still a separate branch. It's not to be interfered with, and it's respected. And you have then these amendments to the Constitution, which are so important, and which you require a 2/3 majority, as I understand it, to overthrow, and you're never going to get that. So realistically, therefore, you will not overthrow freedom of expression or the right to bear arms. You can manipulate it from beneath by allowing companies to ban freedom of expression and all this kind of stuff, but you can't actually use the law. So this is very important. Now, England has never had that. It's a much older country. It doesn't have a written constitution. Whatever, and it had a system that had developed very slowly over time, and that system pretty much worked. It kind of worked, but unfortunately, the Parliament was able to pass restrictions on freedom of expression, and it did, in particular under Mrs. Thatcher in the 1986 Public Order Act, where banning incitement to racial hatred and things like this. Now, these laws were passed, and they were quite vague. But they were passed in a context in which England was overwhelmingly English, and in which there was just a sort of unwritten rule that, of course, you respect free speech. Of course, you respect free association. Of course, you don't throw people whose political views. Of course, you don't discriminate against someone due to their political views. You don't do that. You just don't do that, old chap. So there didn't need to be laws to protect us from it, and there never were such laws because you just don't do that. Now, unfortunately, what happened under Tony Blair was that you had the rise to power after a very long time in opposition of these very bitter, resentful left-wing people who, again, the manipulation, the smiling Tony Blair, Cheshire Cat, George Bush's poodle, whatever, what is important, I'm so nice. And what they do, slowly but surely, using salami tactics, is engage in something they've already been engaging in for a long time, beneath the bonnet, beneath the hood, as you say in America, which is a Gramscian march to the institutions. And they understand, and they consciously understand and are aware of it, the importance of doing this, of taking over the institutions and then altering the institutions in such a way that even when they are ejected from power, they are still in power forever. And that is what they managed to do. So they brought in these institutions which weren't there before, such as the Supreme Court, and they farmed out various aspects of parliamentary ability to pass laws on whatever subject to quangos, to quasi-non-governmental organizations, to these groups that are not elected, that are appointed. And then they slowly brought in rules whereby, and encouraged the professions to bring in rules, whereby in order to be part of a particular profession, and thus part of one of these quangos, you had to be anti-racist. And first of all, they said, oh, well, it seems so reasonable at first, isn't it? You have to say that, oh, I'm not racist, I'm not going to discriminate against other races. But then that's where it starts. But then it becomes you can't be homophobic. And then it becomes you can't be transphobic. And then it becomes you have to actively show your active anti-racist credentials, which is now the case, to be a lawyer, to be a judge. And so you get to the point where the only people that can be involved in these institutions, realistically, are either people that are left-wing or people that are able to not just pretend to be left-wing, not just pay lip service, but must actively show that they are left-wing. And that was written into the rules of these institutions, equal with the police as well, with all other institutions. And it was gradually done. It was gradually done so that no one questioned it, right? Starting off saying you can't just be an open Nazi, which was crossing a line because it was politicizing them, really. To then saying, oh, yeah, you can't be racist and you've got to say you're not racist. To then saying, oh, well, you can't be sexist or homophobic. And to then saying you've got to be actively, that's the next line, actively anti-racist, actively pro-transsexual or whatever. And that's what they've done. And those rules are in place. And so therefore, anyone that is not left-wing is driven out of the institutions. Power is given over to these institutions, such as the Supreme Court. And so therefore, what you have is, and the civil service, and they're then they're then appointing people, even if they don't have these rules, which they do. You've then got left-wing people running the institutions that then appoint other left-wing people, that then appoint other left-wing people, and so on. And before long, you have completely politicized previously neutral institutions, such as the civil service, such as the courts, such as the police, such as the fire brigade, such as the church. Every single organ of state has gone through this slow salami tactics kind of process, so that the parliament doesn't really have much power at all. So it doesn't really matter who the people elect. The people can elect a government that says, as they did do, oh, we're going to cut immigration. And that government, I don't know if you've seen Yes Minister, but that government will be confronted not with conservative right-wing civil servants like Sir Humphrey Appleby in Yes Minister, but by left-wing woke civil servants who will come up with every way to stop them actually implementing government policy. And then if they try to, well, then another thing that the Labour Party did is sign up to the Human Rights Act, again, manipulatively named. Who can question it? Who can say there shouldn't be human rights? The key element of it was that you shouldn't be able to execute people on stuff. Who can question it? But what it means, right to a family life, right to not be discriminated against. We've had cases in England of a boy and his family who weren't deported back to their country because the boy likes chicken nuggets and you can't get chicken nuggets in his home country. And that was passed by a left-wing judge. It was upheld. The family cannot be deported because the boy can't get his chicken nuggets in Jamaica or wherever it is he comes from. I mean, that's what's happened. That's how politically biased these judges are. And they can be because the Human Rights Act is so vague. It's so open to interpretation. Why? Because when it was passed, it was assumed that the judiciary was reasonable and impartial. Now the judiciary are not reasonable and impartial, and they can take advantage of this act to do whatever they want, to subvert the government. And that's what's happened. And so the government can't really do anything, even if it wanted to.
So several things there. One, this has been perhaps one of the most interesting, under-discussed aspects of the Trump presidency, his second time around, has been the battle between the executive and the judiciary, right? You've seen the Trump government going after these extreme left-wing judges. For example, a judge who had a illegal immigrant wanted for a serious crime. He was in her courthouse for some minor traffic infraction or, driving drunk or something like that. And she let him escape. She said, ICE is coming for you. Here, walk out the back door. She's facing charges now. So there does seem to be a desire from the executive to at least solve some of that. But I think that this connects to something we spoke about earlier, right? As this kind of slow march through higher education, the civil service, it lines up with another trend, which is the increasing female presence in these institutions. For instance, American universities are roughly 60-40 female to male. And in kind of a broad cultural context, right, women function often as sort of especially in education system, as moral enforcers, right? So, if you went to a church school or something like that, you had these kind of, the term in American would be like an old battle axe, right? Just some kind of like dour-faced older woman, going around saying, tuck your shirt and do that stuff. And
Karen.
Exactly. That archetype remains unchanged, but the direction, right, has completely changed, to your point. And
if you look at Jim Goad's book, The New Church Ladies, he summarizes it quite well. But George Orwell said in 1984 that it was always the women, the noses out of unorthodoxy, the enforcers. And this is true. I've got a book coming out later this year called Genius Under House Arrest: The Cancellation of James Watson. Now, he was essentially cancelled by women, and the nature of the university has changed so much. When he was at Clare College, Cambridge in the early 50s, and he made his breakthrough and he discovered DNA, the structure of DNA, university life was so different because there was this fundamental belief in the truth and the pursuit of truth. The belief in God had gone. Universities were unfree. They were unfree until 1871 in England. Oxford, Cambridge, and Durham, which were the three universities, were like they are now. It's just that you didn't have to be woke to get in and get along. You had to be Anglican. And if you weren't Anglican, you'd have to go to university in Scotland, or you'd have to go to university abroad, or you'd have to go to university, one of the so-called dissenting academies that there existed. And these dissenting academies are quite interesting. I mean, oxygen was discovered at a dissenting academy. But after the universities liberalized, because frankly their reputations were shredded, they were considered finishing schools for the upper class rather than serious intellectual institutions, and they were on the verge of bankruptcy essentially. So they liberalized, and you let back in what founded the universities, which is the genius. The genius type founded these universities. What is the genius type like? He's basically a very manly man. He has outlier high intelligence, and he combines this with moderate psychopathy, which is masculine, is a masculine kind of trait, and moderate autism. And autism is the extreme male brain. It correlates quite strongly with testosterone. It means that you are low in empathy, which is a female thing, and you are high in systematizing, which is a male thing. And this means that you have low impulse control in a sense, so you can think outside the box, you can think the unthinkable, you're antisocial. And you either don't care that your new idea offends vested interests. In fact, you might quite like the idea. Or you're too autistic to realize that it does. And so you adamantly and bloody-mindedly pursue the truth. And that is where innovations come from. And because those innovations have consequences, they're good for your group, whatever, they aid the understanding of the world, the university gains status and it gains prestige. And it becomes something that intelligent people go to. The problem is that it then sucks in the midwits. I call this the priestly cycle of university. It sucks in the midwits, the people that have a high IQ, but not sort of very high, not above 130, not outlier high, just high. And those people, of course, being a normal range intelligent, correlates not with creativity, but with being socially conformist. Intelligent people look around the world, they notice the in thing, they notice the dominant set of values, they norm map better, and they have the impulse control to force themselves via effortful control to believe whatever the dominant way of thinking is, and then to competitively social signal it in order to attain status, and that's what they do. So once those people come in, then they will put conformity to whatever the de facto church is really at the time, whether it's Anglicanism or woke or whatever, above the pursuit of truth. And eventually that means driving out these truth-obsessed genius types. And then the university gets taken, just becomes an arm of the state, basically, becomes a finishing school for the upper class, doesn't really do any interesting research.
Well, and not even for the upper class, right? Yeah. Because effectively in America, it's, I believe, roughly, it is close to half.
But that's because you've done something very stupid, which you were also doing, and we've done as well in England, something very stupid, which we were also doing, by the way, at the point just before the Civil War. You had elite over promotion. So yes. you've been giving out degrees like sweeties. You know, that's your own fault. But yeah, you're right. It's the upper and the middle. It's a rite of passage now for basically anyone with a slightly above average IQ, which is crazy. And of course, that further undermines the validity of the degree. It further undermines the university. It further damages things.
And to that point, there was actually a very interesting article that just came out of, I believe it was Bloomberg, where the earnings now for a white male, and part of this has to do with discrimination, but also just with the decreasing the significance of a college education. But effectively, your earnings, there's no difference between the earning of a college graduate and someone who went straight into the job market, right? It has effectively reached 1-to-1 parity, at least for white men. Again, sort of proving your point, but I'm sorry I interrupted you.
It's completely pointless going to university. Yeah. So now what happens then if you let women in? Well, women are even more extreme than these socially conformist midwit men. First of all, you don't get outlier high intelligence among women. It's much more bunched towards the mean because there's less variability. Secondly, they are much more interested than men are in empathy and everyone getting along and basically equality and harm avoidance than they are in structure and order and systematizing. Thirdly, they are relatively low in systematizing. And fourthly, you then get a bell curve of people where there is an outlier of people that are very high in social anxiety, that have sort of a very emotionally unstable, that will easily get triggered and hurt, that can't think logically. As we know, women are not as good at analytic thinking as men because they feel certain emotions much more strongly. And you see the kind of female argumentation, everyone knows this. They are less systematic thinkers. They are the ultimate male brain is the systematizing brain. The ultimate female brain is system blind, but very high in empathy. So you get these outliers of women who are higher in conscientiousness than men and higher in agreeableness than men, but are and can write nice sounding essays and use lots of words because they have high verbal intelligence, but are system blind, are basically illogical. And then, of course, you get women that have these kind of personality disorders, cluster B disorders, things like borderline personality disorder that are higher among men. And so inevitably you get to a situation where the culture of the university changes. It must do. And it becomes less about systematizing and logic and reason and the pursuit of truth, because these things are less important to women than equality and harm avoidance and everyone feeling that they're getting along and social conformity and feelings not being hurt. And before long, they have turned the university into what they should be doing at their age, which is running a great big nursery school. And then you'll have the enforcers, the Karens, that will be there to enforce the speech codes and all of these things that are anathema to the genius type. And so the genius is even more strongly driven out of the university. And the university becomes even less about truth and reason, and even more just a place where people can explore their feelings and just a nonsense, as is best manifested in cultural anthropology. What the hell is a cultural anthropology PhD? It's basically a PhD where middle class women find things they like and get to do a PhD about it. I was at a conference in Helsinki. Yeah.
Well, to provide an example, when I went to university, I was going to a fairly prestigious program that had been started by this sort of academic, quite notable in his field. I'll leave it at that. And my last year, he was retiring, and they were basically giving this program over to a sort of comedic stereotype of a female academic. Had never done anything other than collect pointless degrees. And it was a finance program, right? So fairly heavy on math, right? A lot of legal theory as well, right? As you can imagine. And she instituted a new program, which is we had to take a 3-hour block class several times a week in financial counseling, which is something that does not really exist. But effectively, she wanted to teach us how to
be therapists.
Talk through, literally, to be therapists for people with gambling disorders and the like, which is fairly specialized. And it was absolutely ridiculous. It was plainly ridiculous. But you see that transition between someone who, even if quite progressive, was individually competent. And when they are replaced with effectively an ideologue mixed with a nursery manager.
I had so who was the chap I interviewed on my show, and he's saying that he was a lecturer in creative writing. Now, you might argue this is an inherently pathetic kind of a subject, but if done well, I suppose it could be interesting. And when he got involved, it was a woman, but an older woman of an older generation, and it was done properly, and it was about actually producing quality writing. How it's an art form. How do you produce? It has in a sense, it can be argued to have objective standards. In a sense,
yes.
How do you produce persuasive writing? How do you produce writing that moves people to tears? How do you produce writing that makes people laugh? This can be logically analysed. And in a sense, although there's a strong, perhaps intuitive element to it, in a sense, to some extent, it can be taught. And then, of course, she retired, was taken over by a new generation, and then it's just all about expressing your blackness and all this kind of thing. And we get to a point now where even in something like modern poetry in America, there's a poetry journal called the Journal of Classical Poetry or something like this. And that has to exist because so much poetry is just complete nonsense. It's just people saying, "Oh, I'm black, I'm sad, racism."
Well, and to your point about writing, this has produced some really interesting, again, anecdotes. But there was a anonymous sort of open letter written by a similar university lecturer talking about how their students at the undergraduate level had, over the course of this, anonymous writer's career, lost the ability to understand a omnipotent narrator. Right? They had gotten too far away to understand, the voice of the author in a book. And he was saying that this made it very, very difficult to teach a literature course because students are saying, well, why is the author so arrogant? Why is he telling me what this person is thinking? Which at that point, you've moved very far away from the core conceit at writing a novel. But to your point, right, that the consequence of moving away from being taught to write on a technical level first and to a mode of self-expression, which has actually happened in American public schools as well. We've moved away from traditional essays, right? You might write an essay about Alexander to writing your reaction in response to this information. It becomes purely self-expression and leads to obviously a situation in which, well, how can you tell me my self-expression is incorrect? Which, okay, fair enough. That may make some degree of sense, right, within this kind of stupid situation, but it attacks a very core skill set which is how to write, how to communicate yourself in a systematic and, I guess you could say, like, transferable way, right? How do you transmit information from one person to another? Again, just a way in which a fairly basic cornerstone of being educated, right? The ability to express yourself has sort of been lost to this kind of like political nonsense.
Yes, this is indeed so, and then you get the rise of what I call you might call them Karens. I call them the head girl, or my colleague Bruce Charlton rather calls them the head girl type. And these are the head prefects. You don't even have them in America, perhaps, but the head prefects at girls' schools. And these people are intelligent within the normal range. They are highly socially conformist. They are hardworking towards socially approved goals. They are socially skilled. They are ambitious. They are exactly the opposite of a genius. And who are you going to give the job to when interviewing at university? The accomplished, pretty head girl with all her grade A's and all this stuff, or the weirdo, eccentric genius with ill-fitting clothes and uncombed hair, and he's probably got really high grades in some things but bad grades in others because he just doesn't give a toss about them. So he's only interested in what he's interested in, kind of thing. Well, which one? Like Jim Watson's a good example of this. He was not a person that got top grades. He got top grades in the things he liked. And then he couldn't be buggered with other things, and that was the case even within his degree. And so who are you going to give the job to? And of course you give it to the head girl, and eventually the head girl begets head girls, and then before long the whole university research is just getting stuff other people have written and adding a bit on the end. University lectures are just getting the notes you made when you were an undergraduate, reading those out. And there's no originality, there's no creativity, and you just have this farm for qualifications that might vaguely signal some level of intelligence. And that's about it.
Yeah, well, I think that, to your point, the kind of iterative nature of it, this is something that the rise of quote unquote artificial intelligence has made even worse, right? Because if you've talked to anyone who works in education at all, if they have to do writing, they're inundated with AI written or AI edited content, which is effectively, right, nothing but chopping up terabytes of information and restacking it, right? It is entirely iterative. There is no sort of creativity to it. Maybe a discussion for another time, but Dr. Dutton, we are coming.
I thought you wanted to focus on the collapse of Britain and the Civil War and stuff like that.
I did, but we got distracted. And actually,
right.
if you could, and sorry, I brief aside, very bad about getting distracted, especially if it's an interesting conversation. But as we sort of wrap this up, I'm curious, what do you make of those predictions of civil war? Because maybe I'm too much of a political realist, but to me, I look at my own civil war, your civil war, and I don't see the rival elite group to make sort of a separate government. But nonetheless, right, it seems as if your own government, in some capacity, if you believe the leaks, are preparing for civil war, quote unquote. So what do you make of that? And also, where do you think this pressure will go? Because it seems to be building. Right, it seems to be again a tinderbox. Building
more and more people. Multiculturalism has always wrought problems because you're dealing with people who are, on average, going to be, in many cases, less intelligent, more clannish, more ethnocentric. That will therefore look upon the native population with contempt, more violent, more impulsive. So it's always wrought problems. Now, that was contained for a long time because the vast majority of the country were completely against it. The whole of the older generation and the generation born when we first brought it in, and the generation that fought in the war and so forth, and the generation after the war, they were all white, and they were all completely, almost all of them, apart from a few virtue signalers and whatever, were completely against this. We have younger people that have got more used to it, that have made friends that are non-white, that have bonded with them and whatever, that are more open to it, that have been inculcated with this new morality, which says that to be a good person, you have to be anti-racist. And that's very, very important. This shift in morality that occurred in the 80s, from you judge a person by how their behavior to you judge a person by their beliefs, and it's these beliefs. And these beliefs make you civilized, and these beliefs make you good. And then emotionally insecure and anxious people want to make themselves, who are not of very high status, want to believe they're of high status, so they adopt the high status belief and then go on about it and sort of create a narcissistic false self that has that belief, and then attack others that don't agree in order to bolster their full self, that they're perfect or whatever. And so you can see how among people that are mentally unstable, and those are the people that are on the left, on average, they're more mentally unstable than those on the right, they are going to be pushed towards believing this, and women are going to be pushed towards believing it because they're socially conformist and because they're socially anxious, and socially anxious people socially conform, and so on. And then in particular, at the outlier level, you get these cluster B personality traits among women: histrionic disorder, borderline personality disorder, and they, of course, must uber conform and really, really strongly express their social conformity to reassure themselves, and so on. The new Karens, the new church ladies. So that's what's going on. But it's pushed so far, and so many people are experiencing it now, that there's basically no escape from it. We've got rural towns that were 90%, 95% white 15 years ago that are now sort of 70% white. Small villages that suddenly have them put in their hotels that are in these villages, and then they're sitting outside the schools and photographing the kids and following the kids home and whatever. There's so many of them, and unfortunately, because they can't house them anywhere, they're being concentrated into hotels in small, overwhelmingly white towns that thought they were protected from this stuff. If they could just absorb them into places that are already lost, like Leicester or London or whatever, it probably wouldn't matter. But that's not what they do. There's no space to do that. They have to put them in these hotels, wherever there is a hotel. And where are hotels? Where do people want to go on holiday? Nice places, white places. So therefore, all these new places are suddenly being exposed to it. Even in Northern Ireland. I mean, Northern Ireland must be about 95% white, and yet you're getting riots in Northern Ireland over this, and the Catholics and Protestants essentially being united against the new enemy. So it's reached a tipping point, and it's come to the fore. And the Boris wave was probably relevant. There's just so many of them, and they don't work, and they hate the British people, and the government brings them in and promotes multiculturalism, and says last summer with that shocking Southport massacre, takes the side of the anti-British, says that you are far right thug if you protest, jails people for 31 months for a tweet when statutory rapists who are from Afghanistan or rapists get less time in prison than that. So you have an obvious two-tier justice system where non-whites just get a slap on the wrist, basically, are let off because the judges are woke, remember, but white people, and white, you said that they hate them. Yes, they do hate them. They do hate them. They do hate the people. Why do they hate the people? Because what are the kind of people that virtue signal and left with? They are hateful people. They are people who are very high in neuroticism, who are very mentally unstable, who see the world as a dangerous, awful place that they have to take control of, who are deeply insecure and thus create a sort of a narcissistic false self in which they are morally perfect. And what makes you morally perfect is to be pro-multiculturalism. And these people, the working class people, are not on board with that. The working class people's purpose, if you're left wing, is to virtue signal with. You virtue signal with people that are genetically distant from self. You're middle class, you pretend that you like the working class more than the middle class in order to create a coalition with the working class to take power over the middle class. You're a born traitor. That's what they do. Now, once that happens, the working class, once you're confronted with something that you can virtue signal even more about, i.e. it's even more marginalized, it's even more pulling on the heartstrings, like non-white people or gays, then you virtue signal with those. You move on to that, and you make a new coalition with those people. Those people are your coalition now to dominate everybody else. And the working class whites cease to be part of your coalition. In fact, they are now an enemy to your coalition because they don't like this multiculturalism, which is necessary for you to have a sense of moral superiority. They are against it. And they indeed do disgusting things like vote for right-wing parties or vote for Brexit. So they are your enemies. They are threatening you. They are threatening your narcissistic false self. They are threatening your Machiavellian desire for power. They are actually your enemy. They are a problem for you being in power and you getting your narcissistic supply. So you hate them. And worse still, you know you're not allowed to hate them and you can't say you hate them. So this creates cognitive dissonance where you feel a sense of uncertainty. And that makes you hate them even more because they're causing you cognitive dissonance. So you absolutely despise them. And you, in a sense, you want to bring in more immigrants just to kind of hurt them. And also because doing so allows you to virtue signal. So the left and bump yourself up with your coalition. So you as the left are not going to do anything about this at all. You're just going to make it considerably worse. With the right, because the zeitgeist has shifted, even the Conservative Party, in order to persuade a partly manipulated, middle-class media, let's face it, it's those in power that direct the culture. It's not those from below, really. So they played the multicultural game as well. I mean, they've just elected a black leader after having installed an Asian leader. And when the white leader that they did elect was prime minister for 60 days, there was basically a coup by the banking system, and she was removed. And she tried to end this kind of stuff, but she didn't have the power to do so. So that's the situation. The elite despise, and not just despise, but fear the people. That's another thing, particularly with the left. Remember, left-wing people are neurotic. They are, on average, physically weak compared to right-wing people. The men are shorter compared to right-wing people. The women are uglier compared to right-wing people. They're not going to win fights. So there's a degree to which they kind of fear the violence that they see the working class as capable of. I mean, like that situation you had in America in January the 6th. Those people, I think, in the right situation, if there had been people like Nancy Pelosi present, they'd have killed her. They'd have killed her. And I think these people really do fear things like that. That it's their representatives. So they send in this group, Stand Up Against Racism, it's called, to stand there protesting against people that are protesting against an Ethiopian paedophile raping a little girl. And they're calling them far right because they have to get a sense of narcissism, because they're mentally unstable. But also I think that the government are just desperate for some optics to put this down. And they start with that. But the British people are inured to it by now. So then they start sending left-wing operatives among a crowd of, women that are wearing pink and singing the Okie Kokie and saying no more rapes. And those people are violent because, of course, they're violent. They're paid by the government, I suspect. And so then they use that as an excuse to shut down the protest. This happened at this hotel in London the other day. I mean, this is how desperate they are. And they've only got so much in the way of policing. So I suspect that eventually it will get to a point where things will kind of fall apart. I don't think when you say civil war, I'm not sure about, what is a civil war?
Exactly. That is not my term. You see it in the media.
It's David Betts. It's a guy at King's College London called David Betts. He's a Canadian academic, and he's the one that talked about this. He said that it will spark off in somewhere like Leicester. But I think that's more doable in somewhere like America, because in America you have 50 different states, you have 50 different legal systems. I think polarization is probably worse there between Republican and Democrat. And you probably do have the ability, as happened in the Civil War, because you've got the infrastructure of a state within each state. You've got, it's the United States to some extent, not completely, but to some extent you've got National Guards and things like this. So
this has actually started to happen sort of quietly over the last 10 years. So for instance, even on a state level, right? Virginia, where I live, is a very politically divided state. You have the sort of DC suburbs, which are very, very left wing, as you can imagine, a lot of government workers. And then the rest of it, which is, that's where infamous Reverend Jerry Falwell was from, right? It's very, very conservative. And context is not particularly important, but a Democrat comes in, markets himself as a moderate, and starts doing insane things, right? Starts promoting, post-term abortions, starts going after, firearms, going after certain, religious freedoms. And what's interesting is that I think it was 90, or there were 90 counties. I think it was more than 2/3 of the counties in the state basically said, you in what army? We're not enforcing your laws anymore. Right. So that's interesting. That's on a local level. But even during, the years subsequent, you have the rise of sanctuary cities. You have, for instance, as in Texas, right, a group of, left-wing Texas politicians fleeing the state so they can't be forced to vote on something they're going to lose. And the state of Illinois saying, we will provide them cover. We won't let you arrest them. We'll turn your agents away at the border. Let alone what we've seen with other laws around, drugs or, certain firearms in different states. But the reason that that's worth discussing is that is fundamentally a different thing than we see in the UK, right? There is more localized power. And so the reason, to me, I agree with you. I don't see there being a civil war in kind of a classic sense. But
I think it would be more like Northern Ireland. And they talk about Northern Ireland as being a civil war, a low level, at least at first, it would be a low level civil war for a very long time. And you can see how it would happen. I mean, South Africa, for example, the government can't enforce the law. And so the government is too incompetent to enforce the law. The government doesn't have the money to enforce the law. The government is too corrupt to enforce the law. So all that's happened is that you've got areas of the country that are essentially breaking the law, but it's not enforced because they can't enforce it. So, and they also need the tax base of the white people in South Africa, so best not to piss them off. So, this is what's happened there. And so you have essentially areas that have broken away. You have large areas, white areas, where there is no law and order. So what you've got is private security companies. And those private security companies, they're basically protection rackets. What else are they? They're protection rackets. And you advertise on your house which private security company you have. And people know if they come into your house, if you go into the house, you're going to get blinded with something. You're going to get, you're going to get arrested illegally. And you're going to get dealt with. So don't. And that's the kind of thing that happens in the breakdown of law and order. I mean, you don't have to go that long ago in England to be in a situation, let's say the 16th century, where the government didn't control anything outside London. Like Somalia now, the government controls Mogadishu. Everything outside Mogadishu is warlords, is basically protection rackets. And that is what will happen. And that's what happened in Northern Ireland. I mean, you had Free Derry, for example, famously, where the British government didn't control Derry, or that part of London. It was the IRA. Everyone knew that. That was the government. And so you're going to get something gradually like that. And you are already getting a situation because of the internet and general polarization where people that are right-wing, that are young anyway, they all know each other. And they're becoming increasingly right-wing because once you get into a right-wing group, you right-wingness signal. And now we've got debates over how, you have to be white to be English. End of. I mean, we wouldn't, 10 years ago, nobody was publicly saying things like that. And now we have even Suella Braverman, who was a government minister under the Conservatives, who's Indian extraction from Goa, saying, yeah, I'm British, but I'm not English. Almost as if she realizes the way things are going and thinks she'd better kind of, English alive.
Yeah, carve herself out a spot. Yeah.
Carve herself out a spot and get on the side with the right-wing people and they'll look after her and kind of adopt her almost, which, I mean, you guess that is a good point, isn't it? I mean, if we compare the English to a genetic family, people can marry into your family and you can see them as family, and she's married an English person, and so you can kind of see that that nuance to it. So I think that's the kind of thing that would happen. You just get breakdown. You just get the government would be so overstretched. The police don't enforce law and order anyway now. It's basically a narco-tyranny at this stage where you will be immediately arrested for any heresy offences, but if it's a burglary, can't do anything. So what you'll end up with is protection rackets. And what you end up then is de facto microstates. And then they can coalesce. And as people start moving out, white flight from Browning areas, you get these kind of gradually separate, de facto separate, sort of almost like, I call them Neo-Byzantiums, where European society kind of an order holds out. And eventually the government is just meaningless. That's the kind of thing that I could foresee. But if it gets very nasty, the problem is that it is the European man, it is English people that control the countryside overwhelmingly. And where are the electricity power stations? In the countryside. Where are all the pylons that carry the electricity around the country? In the countryside. Where are the gas stations? In the countryside. Where are the oil deposits? In the countryside. Where are the rivers that carry water into the cities? In the countryside. And what Betts argues, I'm not saying he's right, but it's a good point, is it wouldn't take much for people in the countryside to just cut off the cities and starve them and poison them. It wouldn't. They're very fragile to something like that happening.
Yeah, the interesting point, and then we can wrap this up. Nick Land has a great, I can't remember if it's an essay or a chapter in a book called the Cracker Factory. Right, it's sort of a tongue-in-cheek title, but he talks about the Anglo mode of resolving conflicts, which is effectively, well, if we can't agree, I'll just leave. Right, I'll start my own state. And this is a very well-established pattern in America, right? A large number of our states were started because of relatively minor religious disputes, right? Like, okay, you've lost the political struggle. We're going to make you start your own state. And similarly, since the Civil Rights Act, since a number of changes, you've seen that sort of pattern of flight over and over and over again, right? People talk about the deplorable state of American cities and American suburbs, and they're not entirely wrong. They're sort of blaming the wrong people for that. But I'm actually almost surprised that there isn't more conversation about white flight in England. Maybe it's just that the term is highly Americanized, but I think that your point about the dissolution of centralized power is well made. Dr. Dutton, again, like I've said, we've gone well over time. It's been an interesting discussion. If people want to find more of you and your work, I know you mentioned your upcoming book. How can they find it?
Well, all my books are available on Amazon. If you want to see a full list of my publications, it's edwarddutton.com. I have a YouTube channel, which is The Jolly Heretic, and I live stream Mondays at 7 p.m. UK time, which is 2 p.m. New York. And then I've got a Substack, which is jollyheretic.com, where I put in-person interviews and vlogs and movies I make and stuff I can't put on YouTube. And where if you like what I do, you can support me there for the cost of a pint of English beer a month. I don't know how much beer costs in America. It's weird beer in America because I was in an American bar. I was in a bar in, I think it was it Denver? No, it was Raleigh. It was Raleigh, North Carolina. And I didn't realize.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, it was all right place. But in this bar, I didn't realize the beer wasn't 4%, which was what beer normally is, but 8%.
Yes.
And I no one told me that because I wasn't from there. And so, I had a pint and I had another pint. And I thought to myself, God, I'm feeling it a bit. All right. And then I think I had 4 pints. And of course, in doing so, I accidentally had 8. So you've got to be careful in America with the beer. It's strong. It's strong stuff. The beer in parts of
this is very much the triumph of the free market, because we have literally hundreds of options, and the high volume beers have become kind of trendy among a certain class in kind of the last 10 to 15 years. And I'll put it this way. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. I've been in a very similar situation where I was not aware that I was basically drinking wine. They make them all the way up to 14 or 15%. Yes.
Pint of
it's
wine.
ridiculous.
So we call it winter ale in Finland, and it's marked as such. But anyway, good luck with that, people of Shelby, North Carolina, and Raleigh, North Carolina, with your. I was there in 2013. It was very interesting. Oh yeah, with your very strong beer. I mean, you go for it, chaps. It's you call us English drunks. I mean, that's like in Simpsons and stuff. They make out we English are the drunks and haven't drink too much and are football hooligans, and yet you drink wine beer, which in even in bars in Belgium they would sell that stuff in a glass the size of an egg cup. But you just sell it by the pint. But so no, good luck with you. Good luck to you.
Well, sure thing. And as far as my content, The Jay Burden Show is available Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. If you want the episodes early and ad-free, you have to throw me a few dollars a month. You can do so on Substack or Patreon. Again, Dr. Dutton, this was a ton of fun. And to everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.